Okay, good evening. Welcome, everyone. Hello. My name is Ursula Daxecker. I'm Professor of Democracy and Conflict in the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. I will be moderating this event tonight, and I have been looking forward to it for months, and I think for you it's been the same. I'd like to first tell you a little bit about how this lecture came about. So Dr. Bartels' lecture is hosted by a new University of Amsterdam initiative titled Democratic Resilience, and I'm a member of the board of this group, as are some other people in the room, such as Nick. And the aim of the Forum for Democratic Resilience is to allow for cross-fertilization across different disciplines for people who work on democracy in our university. And currently the group consists of people from the law, humanities, and also the social science faculty. And all of us are interested in studying threats to democracy as well as its resilience. And this afternoon, for example, we discussed ongoing work on the normative foundations of democracy. We talked about support for democracy in the Netherlands. We talked about work in progress on political elites' support for democracy in India. So there's a lot of interesting work going on in this project. But the initiative is still new, and we're eager to involve more people. So if you are interested in joining this group, talk to us after the event, or check out our website. We now have a website, and it is, you can find it under democracy.uva.nl. So now I will introduce today's speakers and also the discussants. Dr. Larry Bartels is the May Worthen Shane Chair of Public Policy and Social Science at Vanderbilt University. He's a globally leading scholar on democracy whose work has been agenda setting, which is why we are happy he is here with us tonight. And in two earlier books, he helped dispel confused and romanticized notions of democracy. So in his earlier book, Unequal Democracy, he challenged the idea that democratic policies represent the interests of the average voter, instead showing that it's really the power of the wealthy that defines democratic politics. And in Democracy for Realists, he shows that citizens are largely unable to form and hold sophisticated policy positions. Now, his new book, Democracy Erodes from the Top, is in many ways the logical next step, exploring when, why, and how political elites undermine democracy. Now, beyond Dr. Bartels, we also have two discussants here today who will comment on the book. They are Dr. Sarah de Lange. Dr. de Lange is Professor of Political Pluralism in the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam, and her work is on parties, party families, and party systems with a geographic focus on Europe. And then we have Dr. Nick de Boer, who is Associate Professor in Constitutional Law at the Amsterdam Law School at the University of Amsterdam, and his work is on democratic backsliding and democratic questions about the legal architecture of the financial system. Now with that, I hand over the floor to Larry to present his new book.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure and an honor for me to be in Amsterdam for the first time and to talk about this project. I want to begin by apologizing for sitting down while I speak. I fell on the steps and injured my legs this afternoon. I think if I stand, I might not stay standing long enough to get through the presentation, so I'll just do it sitting down. But the other thing I have to say by way of introduction is that most of the work that I've done over the course of my career, the projects that Ursula described, are projects focused entirely on the United States, and so this is probably an unusual setting in that everyone in the audience probably knows more about the topic than the speaker does. So I'll be interested to get your perspectives on my perspectives, which are very much those of an outsider trying to make sense of European politics. The book is called Democracy Erodes from the Top, and it begins with my understanding of democracy in Europe as I started to think about writing the book several years ago now. I just want to give you some examples of the kind of conventional wisdom that I understood about the state of politics and democracy in Europe. A reporter for the Washington Post wrote, "It shouldn't be too surprising that the worst economic crisis since the 1930s has led to the worst political crisis within liberal democracies since the 1930s." And then a guy who had been an editor of the Washington Post but moved on to become an author of books, even more alarmist sounding. "The Western democracies now seem in danger of collapsing as a backlash against globalization arouses angry opponents of immigration, free trade, and cultural tolerance." And one of the most distinguished academic scholars of comparative politics, Adam Twersky, wrote, "Something is happening. Anti-establishment, anti-system, anti-elite populist sentiments are exploding in many mature democracies. Confidence in politicians, parties, parliaments, and governments is falling. Even the support for democracy as a system of government has weakened." So all of this sounds pretty bleak, but what I did was to turn to survey data to get some sense of ordinary Europeans' views about all these matters, and found, much to my surprise, that in 21st century Europe, virtually none of this seemed to be true. In fact, ordinary Europeans' political attitudes had changed remarkably little over the period that I looked at, which was basically the first 2 decades of the 21st century. The opinions commonly implicated in the so-called wave of right-wing populism and the crisis of democracy, like attitudes toward immigrants and European integration, trust in politicians and political parties, satisfaction with the economy and the workings of democracy, all remained virtually stable, or in some cases even improved over this period. So I want to just give you some examples of those patterns in the data. The data that I'll be looking at here come from the European Social Surveys, which is a collaborative social scientific project involving a couple of dozen different European countries. And most of the surveys were conducted every 2 years over this period. So we have 9 waves of surveys in most of these countries, including the Netherlands. And you can see that there are some countries there where there were fewer than 9 waves. But I'm looking across this set of European countries, basically at the period from 2002 to 2019. I stopped in 2019 because these surveys were suspended during the COVID pandemic and have just now begun to start up again. What I want to do is to show you some patterns in the data, and the graphs that I'll show you are a common setup. In each of them, the scores run from 0 down at the bottom up to 10 at the top. Most of these questions were asked in the surveys as 0 to 10 scales, so you can see the average response to each of the survey questions. The solid red line, thicker red line, is the population-weighted average for Europe as a whole, and then the narrower gray lines are the patterns for individual countries, for the 15 countries for which we have 9 waves of survey data over this period. The first one is favorability toward immigrants. These measures are based on 6 different questions that were asked consistently in each of these surveys in each of the countries about people's attitudes about immigrants and immigration. So 0 is the strongest anti-immigrant attitude down at the bottom. 10 up at the top is the most favorable set of attitudes toward immigrants. And you can see that overall there's been a gradual increase in favorability toward immigrants over this period. Much of that increase turns out to be due to generational replacement, since in almost all of these countries, younger people are more favorable toward immigration, more relaxed about immigration than older people are. And so as the electorate has turned over, people have generally become somewhat more favorable toward immigration across Europe and in most of the countries considered separately. The overall increase over this period amounts to a little less than half a point on this 0 to 10 scale. Here's the pattern for support for further European integration. Again, pretty moderate opinions overall, a little bit of fluctuation, a brief downturn in the immediate wake of the euro crisis, but overall really no change at all. between the early 21st century and the most recent surveys in 2018-19. So the idea that there's been a backlash in the public against the European Union seems not to hold up in these data either. Here's a measure of ideological polarization, which is just the spread of responses of people's placements of themselves on left-right scales in each country. If politics was becoming more polarized, you'd expect to find more people on the far left and far right, and so an increase in this measure of polarization, but you can see there's really been no overall increase in polarization over this period either. Trust in Parliament and politicians, again, decreased a little bit in the immediate wake of the Euro crisis, but then rebounded, and basically overall, no change through the 21st century in Europe as a whole. There are some countries, mostly the countries in which people are more distrustful, have been also more variable over time. So the most striking instances of distrust in particular countries have mostly been pretty short-lived. And then finally, satisfaction with democracy. Again, you can see some variation across countries, not a whole lot of fluctuation within countries, and across Europe as a whole, really no overall change in the level of ordinary citizens' satisfaction with the working of democracy in their own countries. So on the whole, very little evidence here for a crisis of democracy in terms of the attitudes of ordinary citizens. But we've heard all this talk about support for right-wing populists increasing over this period, and so the question I ask myself is, how can we have this wave of increasing support for right-wing populism, but at the same time no real change in ordinary citizens' attitudes? What accounts for the wave of electoral support for these right-wing populist parties over this same period? The first thing that I want to say is that the wave itself is greatly exaggerated. If you look across Europe, systematically support for right-wing populist parties has increased, but it's increased really pretty modestly. Here's a kind of summary. It's a complicated story. You can see lots of ups and downs in individual countries. The ups have gotten a lot more attention than the downs have. And if you look at the dotted red line, which is the average level of support for these various right-wing populist parties, you can see that it's increased some over these 2 decades, but pretty modestly. So something like 15% to 18% vote share across Europe as a whole. So there's been some increase, but I think not nearly as much as one might expect given the discourse about the wave of right-wing populism. Partly, I think that has to do with an unrepresentative coverage of these developments in the press. Journalists love scary stories, and the rise of right-wing parties is a scary story. So here's an example from last summer, the election in Spain in the New York Times, coverage of it. A few weeks before the election, the New York Times ran a huge front-page story about the rise of the right and how Spain was going to be next in this global wave of rising support for right-wing populists. Then on the morning of the election, again, a Sunday, the most prominent day of the paper's coverage, another huge front-page story about the far right rising as a kingmaker in the Spanish election. And then the election happened, and to the surprise of the New York Times, the Vox party, the right-wing populist party, actually lost support, and so they ran a brief story on page 6 saying that the result of the election was inconclusive, basically. So anyone who was following this coverage, I think, would have come up with a rather distorted view of the reality of what happened in this particular case. The other thing to say about this is that the press has a real tendency to overgeneralize the lesson of any election in terms of attributing it to a shift in underlying populist sentiment. So if you look at the actual rise of Vox, which happened some time ago, it didn't really have anything at all to do with increasing populist sentiment. It happened years after the worst of the Euro crisis, which was quite bad in Spain. There was a lot of talk about why Spain had no right-wing populist party, in spite of the fact that the unemployment rate was 26% and GDP had declined by 10%. Vox really only rose as an electoral force years after the populist sentiment in Spain had already begun to wane. And its rise really had to do with very specific factors: discontent with the incumbent conservative government's handling of a kind of messy secession vote in Catalonia, and with a huge scandal that had gotten a lot of attention. So the support for Vox, I think, really was not even at the time indicative of a rise in right-wing populism in the Spanish electorate generally, but it got a lot of attention, as every one of these rises of right-wing populist parties in particular countries has. The other thing I think helps to account for this mismatch between the patterns of electoral support and the patterns of attitudes in surveys is that the variation in support for these right-wing populist parties is almost entirely due to what scholars have referred to as supply-side factors, that is, the behavior of political elites, the willingness of entrepreneurs to try to mobilize right-wing populist sentiment, rather than to variation in the demand side, in the level of populist sentiment in these various countries. So I think here's a kind of summary of this. If you look at the sorts of attitudes that are correlated with individual support for right-wing populist parties, they're the kinds of things that you would think of: just conservative positions, right-wing positions on a left-right scale, anti-immigrant sentiment, in many cases anti-EU sentiment, in some cases distrust of politicians. Maybe surprisingly, economic disaffection, not a very important factor in any of these cases in terms of accounting for support for right-wing populist parties. But if you take these various indicators and combine them into a kind of index of right-wing populist sentiment, you do pretty well in terms of explaining which individuals are likely to support right-wing populist parties, but the variation across countries turns out to have almost nothing at all to do with the levels of right-wing populist sentiment in those countries. So looking here along the horizontal axis, you can see the level of right-wing populist sentiment in each country. This is a 0 to 10 scale, but you can see that the country averages only range from about 4 to 6. So in some sense, all of these countries are pretty moderate in terms of their average sentiments. But then if you look at the average vote shares for right-wing populist parties on the vertical axis, you see that there's basically no relationship between the level of right-wing populist sentiment and the support for these right-wing populist parties, which has almost entirely to do with the country-specific factors, the kinds of discontents that lead particular people in particular countries at particular times to support these right-wing populist parties. So to see that a right-wing populist party's vote share has increased, and to infer from that that there's been a sea change in public opinion, I think is almost certain to be mistaken. Here's another way of thinking about the relationship between attitudes and vote shares. Here's the distribution across Europe of this index of right-wing populist sentiment. Now I'm back to the 0 to 10 scales. You can see that there's quite a range of opinions. There are some people at the far left near 0, and there are some people at the far right near 10. So there are people who have very populist attitudes with respect to immigrants, the European Union, distrust of politicians, and so on. The biggest distribution, the first kind of bell-shaped curve that's kind of tan colored there, is the distribution of citizens of Europe as a whole. The smaller gold distribution inside it is the people who actually reported having voted in their national election. So you can see that there's a lot of variability in their attitudes. And then the tiny black distribution down at the bottom is the set of people who actually voted for right-wing populist parties. And you can see that even a lot of the people who have quite strong right-wing populist sentiment are not voting for these right-wing populist parties. In some countries, that's because there is no viable right-wing populist party for them to vote for. But more often, it's because they simply choose to support some other party, usually a more mainstream conservative party. So the politicians haven't yet been very successful at mobilizing the potential right-wing populist sentiment. That's the good news. The bad news is that they haven't yet been very successful in mobilizing this potential right-wing populist sentiment. So in some abstract sense, there's a lot more potential for right-wing populists to make headway in elections than they have so far, but it's subject to these very specific stories about what's happened in particular countries and the skill of particular political leaders. The other thing I want to say about this is that I think it's important to distinguish between electoral support for right-wing populists and anti-democratic or anti-system support. I think looming in the background of a lot of discussions of right-wing populism is the idea that support for right-wing populists is likely to lead to democratic backsliding of some kind. And here's a kind of example of that sort of rhetoric. I'll just read it to you. Far-right populist parties have risen from obscurity to transform the party system of virtually every Western European country. Meanwhile, parts of Central and Eastern Europe bear witness to the institutional and ideological transformations that might be afoot. In Poland and Hungary, populist strongmen have begun to put pressure on critical media to violate minority rights and to undermine key institutions such as independent courts. Now, all of that is true, but what I want you to do is to focus for a moment on the causal argument that connects far-right populist parties in Western Europe and democratic backsliding in Poland and Hungary. It consists of the word meanwhile, right? So this stuff is happening over here, meanwhile this other stuff is happening over there, and we kind of imagine that there must be some connection between them. But I think if you actually look at the process of democratic backsliding in Hungary and Poland, the story sounds pretty different than the kinds of factors that have contributed to support for right-wing populist parties in Western Europe. First, here's just a kind of summary. This is a measure of the quality of democracy in different countries as measured by academic observers in a project called the VDEM project. The dotted line up at the top is the average level of liberal democracy for some high-functioning democracies. Here I've just looked at France, Germany, and Sweden. The middle dotted line is kind of middling, semi-authoritarian or mildly authoritarian countries, and the bottom dotted line is really hardcore authoritarian countries. So that'll give you some sense of the meaning of this scale. And then you can see Hungary, which is the kind of battleship gray line, and Poland, which is the bright red line, kind of trending along, not quite as democratic as the most highly functioning democracies, but pretty close to that level until 2010, when the Fidesz party took power in Hungary, and then 2015, when the Law and Justice Party took power in Poland. And in both cases, then you see a pretty severe decline in the quality of democracy in these countries as these new governments engaged in democratic backsliding of various sorts. The most recent election in Poland threw out these guys, but the right-wing populist party, if you want to call it that, in Hungary has remained in power. But I think it's important to think about how they got to power in the first place. In some sense, they were both right-wing populist parties, but if you look at the campaigns they ran in Hungary in 2010 and in Poland in 2015, they really weren't campaigns that focused on immigration or on the European Union or on the democratic system or distrust of politicians. They really were campaigns that were more about the quality of ordinary people's lives and the corruption of the incumbent governments in both of these cases. And so in the surveys that I've been showing you, where we're measuring anti-immigrant sentiment and attitudes about the EU and about distrust of politicians. In the months just before the key elections, the people who were about to vote for these parties weren't really any different than other people in terms of their average levels of attitudes about immigrants, for example. So the kinds of things that were generating support for right-wing populist parties in Western Europe just didn't seem to be important to these parties taking power. One Hungarian scholar described the result there as accidental. Fidesz won 53% of the popular vote, which was hardly a huge popular mandate given the condition in the country and the fatal discrediting of the incumbent party through years of scandals. But given the way the electoral system worked, that 53% of the vote translated into exactly 2/3 of the seats in parliament, and given the ironclad party discipline within the Fidesz party, Orbán was able to use that 2/3 majority to push through constitutional changes, eroding democratic institutions, cracking down on independent judges and the media and so on. So the democratic backsliding was quite real, but it wasn't in any real sense a response to the mandate of the citizens in the election. And I think that result, which is kind of similar to what seemed to happen in Poland in 2015 as well, was really quite consistent with what scholars have said about full-scale breakdowns of democratic systems in Europe in the mid-20th century and in Latin America in the late 20th century, which is to say that they were breakdowns from the top rather than bubbling up from the bottom, and that ordinary people were often passive and didn't actively try to defend the democratic system or fight back against these authoritarian breakdowns, but neither were they the moving force in generating the authoritarian breakdowns in the first place. Nancy Bermeo, in her book on these democratic breakdowns, wrote, "The culpability for democracy's demise lay overwhelmingly with political elites. In the vast majority of cases, voters did not choose dictatorship at the ballot box." And I don't think we want to call what happened in Hungary or Poland dictatorship. It certainly wasn't the kind of dictatorship that we've observed in other places at other times. But it was a severe erosion of democratic norms and institutions. But again, I think it really was one for which the elites were culpable rather than ordinary citizens. But Bermeo goes on to write about the cases that she was studying. Ordinary people generally were guilty of remaining passive, while they generally did not polarize and mobilize in support of dictatorship. They did not immediately mobilize in defense of democracy either. And again, I think that seemed to be true in Hungary and Poland. These regimes had pretty considerable base of popular support. I think that partly has to do with the fact that ordinary citizens in most places aren't really nearly as attached as we political scientists would like them to be to democracy in the abstract. And so if they find that whatever government is in power is validating their identities and pursuing their substantive political values, that they're likely to support it or at least tolerate it, even if there are some violations of democratic procedures that are annoying to the scholars who are observing this from the outside. But also, I think a lot of the support for these regimes had to do with what was a pretty substantial increase in ordinary citizens' sense of subjective well-being. So these surveys that I've been looking at have a variety of measures that I think are relevant to people's understanding of their own day-to-day lives. And you can see comparisons here in Hungary between 2009, just before Orbán's party took power, and then 2019, after his party had been in power for several years. Massive increases in satisfaction with the performance of the economy, substantial increases in satisfaction with the government, increased trust in parliament and politicians, kind of ironically, satisfaction with the working of democracy, despite that huge downturn in the quality of democracy as measured by outside observers, and maybe most striking, even a substantial increase in satisfaction with people's own lives as a whole, which is something that's really pretty stable over long periods of time in most countries. And then in Poland, if you compare the situation in 2015, just before the Law and Justice Party came to power, and the most recent survey in 2018 and 2019, you see smaller increases, but still substantial increases in people's satisfaction with the economy and government. And so that kind of support, I think, is certainly not going to be a completely invulnerable level of support for a party to maintain itself in power, as we observed in Poland in the most recent election, but in combination with the kind of fiddling that these parties did in order to try to entrench themselves, I think it's a kind of governance that can be successful over at least the medium term in these kinds of countries. The analogy that I draw here is to work on city governments in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century, which were often quite corrupt, so-called boss rule political machines, which often would get themselves elected and then fiddle with the institutions of democracy in various ways to entrench themselves in power for decades, but eventually then would get voted out of power and replaced by reformist parties or coalitions of some kind, which would then attempt to entrench themselves in power in some different way. I think politicians trying to entrench themselves in power is certainly not a universal aspect of democratic politics, but we observe it with some frequency. So what I want to say here, in part, is that democratic theory seems to me to be an obstacle to understanding what's actually happened on the ground in Europe over the last couple of decades. If we see immigration tearing Europe apart, we imagine it must be because anti-European attitudes are on the, anti-immigrant attitudes are on the rise. But in fact, we've seen that anti-immigrant attitudes aren't on the rise. If elites are squabbling over European integration, there must be a public backlash against the EU, but there really is no public backlash against the EU. If populist parties are winning more seats in parliament, it must be because populist sentiments are exploding, but populist sentiments aren't exploding. And if democracy erodes, it must be because support for democracy as a system of government has weakened in the public, but in fact, that seems not to be true either. I think the nature of the mistake in all of these instances is to imagine that what we observe at the level of elite politics must be in some way or another a direct reflection of shifts in mass attitudes. E. Schachtschneider, who is a prominent American political scientist more than half a century now, wrote about our understanding of democratic politics being essentially simplistic, based on a tremendously exaggerated notion of the immediacy and urgency of the connection of public opinion and events. And going back even further, an entire century now, to the public intellectual Walter Lippmann, he wrote a book about the phantom public, in which he said, "There are, I believe, immense confusions in the current theory of democracy, which frustrate and pervert its action. I've attacked certain of the confusions with no conviction, except that a false philosophy tends to stereotype thought against the lessons of experience. I do not know what the lessons will be when we have learned to think of public opinion as it is, and not as the fictitious power we've assumed it to be." Well, here we are a century later, and I also don't know what the lessons will be once we've learned to think about public opinion, not as the fictitious power we've assumed it to be. And more generally, to think about democratic politics, mostly as a matter of elite infighting and machinations and ambition and good or bad choices, rather than as, in some direct sense, a reflection of the good or bad attitudes of ordinary citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. We now move to the two discussants. I suggest we start with Sarah and then move right away to Nick. They'll be commenting briefly, approximately 10 minutes each.
So thank you, Larry, for being with us today, but also thank you for writing a book that explains what is essentially an age-old debate in the social sciences, namely that about structure versus agency, to a broad audience that's concerned about contemporary developments. And for those of you who haven't read the book yet, I highly recommend it because it's extremely accessible. I think you've done a marvelous job of really showing this debate between, what's driving the success of the radical right. Is it ordinary citizens and their attitudes, or is it actually the radical right itself and also the political environment in which it's embedded? And you're certainly not the first to say, well, there's definitely more agency amongst the radical right than assumed by many commentators. Kasmudde, for example, also argued that in his 2007 book. But I don't think it's ever been shown with data that covers such a broad time span, but also such a broad range of European countries. Because in these types of studies, we often see either a focus on Western Europe or Central Eastern Europe. But I also want to, add a little bit of nuance to the story, even though I agree with your general premises. And there's 3 points I want to make. One is sort of what is the scope of the phenomenon we're concerned with. Because, if we take more recent data into account, I think you might be underestimating the importance of the rise of the radical right a little bit. So I'll say something about that. I also would like to say a little bit about the importance of not thinking about demand and supply as two separate things, but the relevance of the permanent interaction between the two and how that, shapes public opinion. And I want to say a little bit also, not only emphasizing the agency of the radical right itself, but the importance of the broader political opportunity structure around the radical right in terms of media, mainstream parties, and how they approach the radical right. So maybe to start with the first, you say we shouldn't overestimate how successful the radical right is. I agree with you to some extent. If you look at the newspapers today, and the way they're writing about the European Parliament elections that are coming up next week, the narrative is very clear. This is going to be the elections of the radical right? This is going to create really a power shift in the European Parliament. But if you go back to the media that were, the publications that came out 5 years ago in the previous European Parliament elections, or even 10 years ago in the European Parliament elections of 2014, you see exactly the same narrative. But there is something different right now. In that sense, it's a pity that your book stops at the pandemic time, because if we look at the current polls, we do see a very significant increase in support for radical right parties, and these parties breaking sort of ceilings that we thought that previously existed in terms of how high their support could become. So if we look at the current polls, we see a significant number of parties that poll between the 25 and the 30%, coming first in their respective member state countries. So that goes for the PVV here in the Netherlands, but it also goes for Flemish interest in Belgium. It goes for the Rassemblement National in France. It goes for the FPÖ in Austria, and it goes for Fratelli d'Italia. And then we see a second set of parties that are currently polling between the 20 and 25% and that are coming second in their respective elections. And I think, from a two-party system perspective, from a US perspective, that is just a relatively modest increase in vote share. But in a European multi-party context, that gives these parties a completely different position in their respective party systems. Coming second or coming first gives a significant amount of additional power in coalition negotiations, for example, influence on dynamics in parliament, etc. So that increase is significant. And it's also especially important, I think, because European party systems have been becoming more fragmented, and mainstream parties have become smaller. So that makes the relative importance of these radical right parties, even if their seat share doesn't increase tremendously, it does make them more important players in the political landscape. So I think that is something particular about the multi-party nature of European politics that is important to keep in mind. So secondly, about demand and supply. So we know that some of these attitudes are relatively stable over time. And I agree, I mean, the data are the data, right? They show these patterns. But at the same time, if you look closer at these over time trends, we do see significant developments, especially in how different subgroups in the electorate change their attitudes on these particular issues over time. If we look, for example, at political trust, and our colleague Tom van der Meer has done a lot of research on this. So the average level of political trust in the Netherlands is relatively stable over time. But what has happened over time is that party identity has become a much stronger predictor of your level of trust than before. So in the past, if we go back 10, 20 years, the averages for different subgroups in the electorate were more or less the same, whereas the average for the populist radical right supporters at the moment is extremely low, while that for supporters of cosmopolitan progressive parties like the Greens or the Social Liberals in the Netherlands has become very high. So in a sense, there's sort of a polarization taking place there on the basis of partisan identity. And we've seen similar over time development, for example, when it comes to cultural attitudes with respect to immigration. If you look at how they are distributed over citizens living in different parts of the Netherlands, we see that it's the higher educated citizens in the metropolises that are drifting apart from the rest of the Netherlands in terms of the attitudes. So again, the average is relatively stable over time, but these higher educated big city dwellers, they are becoming more cosmopolitan and more progressive compared to the rest of the population. And this also goes for another aspect of public opinion that you don't really touch upon that much in the book because you don't have the data, but that's, of course, issue salience. What kinds of problems do citizens see as the most important, and what kinds of social problems are most impactful on their vote choice? And here we do see that, immigration has, for significant groups of citizens, become much more important over time. And I think that here, both in the drifting apart and in the increasing issue salience, it's the interaction between demand and supply that's really significant. Because we've seen a lot of experimental research in recent years where citizens are exposed to the messages of radical right parties, whether that is their nativist messages about immigration or whether that is their populist messages about corrupt political elites. And in those kinds of experiments, we see that they reinforce the attitudes of those that have opinions that are in line with the radical right and the message that they're exposed to, but they don't really affect other groups of citizens. So that, I think, is one of the mechanisms that's contributing to this drifting apart. And that is really the agency of the radical right actually directly impacting on public opinion. There's much more I would like to say. Let me see if I can just pick up on one thing. Yes, maybe because, at the end of the day, it's about democratic backsliding or democratic erosion or whatever you want to call it. I think another nuance that I would perhaps like to make is that when we look at overtime data on how citizens think about democracy, we have rather crude estimates. We have traditional survey questions about satisfaction with democracy, support for the democracy as a political regime type, etc. And if we look at more recent survey questions that have been developed to really tap into citizens' populist attitudes, really this notion of ordinary citizens not being adequately represented by more corrupt political elites, and also populist notions of democracy where the people are sovereign and majority rule is really the model, and there is no infringement from counterpowers such as the judiciary or the media, etc. I think we do see some changes over time, and I think our challenge is that we don't have the data to go back in time to see, what the long-term trends is. But my worry is that, if we would have had more sophisticated measures of really the democracy model that these parties are propagating, that we might actually see more change over time than your public opinion data are currently showing. Therefore, nuancing a little bit that it is only erosion for the top, but perhaps that there's more of a vicious circle of interaction between top and bottom here, between political elites and citizens, than is often assumed.
Okay, so thanks so much for the opportunity to speak here today and offer my reflections on Larry, your book, Democracy Erodes from the Top, and I've learned from it an enormous amount. So I'm a legal scholar, so I'm not really qualified to say anything about the data. I leave that to Sarah. But since reading your book, I've thought a lot about what your work means for my own thinking about sort of safeguarding democracy as well as the rule of law. So in a nutshell, I understand that the core message of your book is essentially that the health of democracy doesn't crucially depend on citizens, but on political elites. So the core question today that I actually want to raise is what do your findings actually mean for ensuring democratic stability? And as a scholar in constitutional law, I'm particularly interested in the role of law in protecting democracy and legal institutions such as courts, for example. So I considered actually that the best point maybe to start my reflections was by the example of our new government coalition agreement that we have here in the Netherlands, and for which, of course, Geert Wilders provides the biggest party. So maybe as you know, the title of their agreement that they presented a little over 10 days ago translates as Hope, Guts and Pride. So it sounded bad in Dutch, but it also sounds quite bad in English, I think. But apart from the title and moreover, more generally, the mediocre prose, I think, that characterizes this coalition agreement, the agreement also contains a remarkable paradox, I think, when it comes to strengthening the rule of law. So because one of the main goals of the agreement is actually to strengthen the rule of law, or as the Dutch like to say, the rechtsstaat. And strengthening this rule of law was one of the main priorities of the party of Pieter Omtzigt, so one of the coalition parties. And he considered that the Netherlands, for example, should have a constitutional court, like Germany, to protect the fundamental rights of citizens. And this point he made strongly after various scandals affected the Dutch government. And I think the irony of the current agreement is that most proponents of such a constitutional court have often stressed the need for it because of the threat of populist and illiberal politics, with Geert Wilders being a prime example. And it's very difficult, I think, to describe Geert Wilders as a friend of the rule of law and minority rights. His party manifesto promised to put Dutch citizens first again. He wanted to end discrimination of Dutch people, reclaim national sovereignty. His party manifesto also states that the Netherlands is not an Islamic country. There should be no Islamic schools, Qurans, and mosques. Dual citizenship must be banned, and previously Wilders has called journalists scum. He characterized the Dutch parliament as a fake parliament, and he suggested that all Dutch judges were politically biased members of the Dutch Progressive Party, D66. So, considering all this, it's pretty surprising to me that the Dutch governing coalition now wants to strengthen the rule of law as a matter of priority, and that we will get maybe a constitutional court, not with Geert Wilders opposing this move, but actually thanks to his governing coalition. Now, and as a scholar, I've spent quite a significant part of my life thinking about democracy and also the appropriate role of courts in democracy. And now I'm wondering, should we be happy that we're actually getting maybe a constitutional court in the Netherlands? It could be a way to protect vulnerable citizens from populist politics, but it could also maybe lead to a politicization, actually, of judiciary, as in the United States. And this connects, I think, to my broader thinking about democracy. So with students in our master programs, some of my former students are here today. So for this as a repetition, we discussed there broadly two ways of thinking, right? About the relationship between democracy and constitutionalism, democracy and legal limits to democracy. And the first view is that these legal limits are indeed crucial, essentially because democracy is important, but it's also potentially dangerous. Democratic majorities can curtail the rights of minorities and even abolish democracy. So therefore we need a written constitution and courts to protect us from the tyranny of the majority. The opposite idea has always been that such review by courts actually might hamper democratic decision-making and be an unjustified restriction of democracy. And that's a problem because democracy allows us ultimately to live together in the face of disagreement. And we need, in the face of this disagreement, give citizens an equal say in the decisions that bind them and let them determine together to their representatives what the best decision is. And the problem then with subjecting democratic decisions through supervision by courts is that it ultimately gives courts, judges, the last words to certain issues that might be subject to reasonable disagreement. And these people say the resilience of democracy must be found in the democratic process itself. Now, so I'm wondering what to make then of your book, sort of in light of this distinction between different views. So I've always tended to sort of the more democratic view, being a bit skeptical of courts. But that there's a problem with that. I see now that it expresses a sort of deep faith in the reasonableness of citizens and their representatives. It sort of assumes that we have a capacity as citizens as well as political representatives to respect each other, to listen carefully to each other's arguments, take into account its different perspectives, seek the common good in good faith, and that we decide after careful consideration of arguments. And I've often wondered, also in the face of global democratic decline, the rise of populist parties, whether that vision is not hopelessly naive, and perhaps also your book would compel me to think that. At the same time, I think we also see from evidence that legal instruments are insufficient to save democracy, right? So if we look, for example, at Hungary and Poland, we find that these countries, for example, had independent constitutional courts. They did not provide a safeguard against democratic erosion. And actually, they were quite easily captured then by the governing parties and then could be turned into maybe even instruments of illiberalism. And we also see this maybe in the United States, where the Supreme Court is obviously biased, it seems. It has a clear conservative majority. And last week, the New York Times actually reported that Samuel Alito, who is one of the justices of the Supreme Court, had flown an appeal to heaven flag at his vacation house in New Jersey. And this appeal to heaven flag is actually considered a symbol of support for Donald Trump and his Stop the Steal campaign. So and this might be a justice who's actually ruling on certain issues related to this. So it's unclear that legal safeguards will help us against the democratic decay. And then I often thought what we really need and what safeguards democracy is sort of stable adherence among citizens to democratic values. And what I read in your book is that actually maybe that might be true, because the health of democracy doesn't depend decisively on public opinion. Citizens are not a significant check on undemocratic behavior. And it seems often that their attachment to democracy is somewhat superficial. So there's also research that shows, for example, if citizens are confronted between democratic values and their partisan policy preferences, they often prefer the latter. So one study, for example, found in the United States that citizens do care about democracy, and they will punish political leaders to some extent for violating democratic principles. But, for example, if a politician has an extramarital affair, they might punish that harder. They find that more important than whether a leader is willing actually to respect democratic principles. So, should we read your book ultimately as a reaffirmation of the dangers of democracy and as sort of underlining the need for legal limits on democracy? At the same time, you also say in your book that institutions are not decisive. So you write as well that key, it seems, are not the institutions themselves, but the character and values of political leaders operating within and upon them. So this leaves us, I think, with a puzzle at the same time. So how do we create these good political leaders that can uphold democracy? And you refer in your book to the work of Joseph Schumpeter, and sort of elite vision of democracy. And I think one of the big problems with that vision of democracy is that if citizens' commitment to democracy is superficial and citizens should not be really in charge, why do we trust them, or why can we trust them to actually elect responsible leaders? And in this respect, I'm wondering actually whether your final assessment about populism is one that I can share. So you write that it's unduly alarmist to argue that the reservoir of right-wing populist sentiment is enough to constitute a crisis of democracy. But actually what strikes me in the Netherlands is how quickly it seems that unwritten democratic norms seem to deteriorate. So all the statements I've referred to previously about Geert Wilders, he's refused to take them back, right? So he's been asked by his fellow politicians, do you want to take back your calling of journalists a scum? Do you want to take back that the Dutch parliament was a fake parliament, or that your suggestion that all Dutch judges are these members of the party D66? And he said no. Actually, in a parliament debate, he actually said, I'm a very reasonable person, and I'm the constitutional conscience of you all because I've been in parliament for the longest. And despite all this, other mainstream parties in the Netherlands do not distance themselves from Wilders. They're actually willing to govern with them. And thereby they normalize his rhetoric. And you refer in your book to the work of Nancy Bermeo, who actually emphasizes this importance of distancing, which I take to refer to the need for political elites to distance themselves from undemocratic behavior. But it seems to me actually that in the current Dutch context, populism leads to a normalization of undemocratic behavior. So to conclude, if the quality of democracy depends on the quality of our politicians in office, isn't governing with populists who challenge core democratic norms not really, do we not need to consider it as a grave danger actually for democracy because it erodes those norms? And ultimately, amidst the rise of populist politics, how do we ensure that our political leaders actually do remain committed to democracy?
Thank you. So thank you very much for this deep engagement with Larry's work. We have only about 30 minutes left for the rest of this wonderful event. I do want to give Larry a brief chance to respond if you would like to engage with the comments that you've received, but then we will immediately go to the audience.
Yeah, briefly, I think I agree with pretty much everything that both of you said. I want to fall back on the point that I made before, that I'm genuinely deeply confused about the answers to some of these questions. I do think that democracy is dangerous as a general matter, and so I don't have in mind a vision of how we could safeguard it reliably in a way that would work across different political contexts and times and places. I think it really is the difficult job of politicians to figure out how to do politics with as little damage to democracy as they can in the context that they find themselves in. You talked about the mainstream politicians who've normalized Wilders, and certainly they have, but only up to a point, right? He's not going to be the prime minister. And if you look across the countries in which these kinds of situations have arisen, you see some variation in the behavior of mainstream politicians, ranging from a very principled kind of cordoning of the right-wing populists from having any contact with power, on one hand, to kind of overdoing the responsiveness to their constituents and exaggerating their influence, as in Britain with the Brexit vote, just kind of through a political blunder more than anything else. There's an interesting instance in the surveys where the survey in Sweden was conducted just after an election in which the Sweden Democrats did well. It wasn't the most recent election, but the one before that. And after the election, there was a long process of coalition negotiation, as here, in which it became increasingly clear over a period of 4 or 5 months that the Sweden Democrats, in spite of being the second largest party, were again going to be shut out of the coalition. And you could observe in the responses of the supporters of the Sweden Democrats in these surveys satisfaction with democracy tanking over the course of this 4 or 5 months. Not surprisingly, they saw that they were once again getting screwed and being kept out of having any influence over policymaking. If you're 20 or 25 or 30% of the population and the system is rigged in a way that keeps you from having any influence in parliament, that would be something that would probably lead to political distrust and dissatisfaction with democracy. So I think it's a real hurdle, a real difficulty for mainstream politicians to figure out how to avoid catering to these dangerous extremists on one hand, but on the other hand, not behave in a way that further radicalizes and alienates their supporters. In almost every country at almost any time, I think this reservoir of potential support for extremists exists in the general public, and the question really is, will it be mobilized? Will it be translated directly into political support? In the US, I think we have a very odd idea about current politics because many of us came up in an era of unusual political harmony in the period after World War II, and I think the same thing is true in Europe. There was a period of unusual stability of the party system after the Second World War. That broke down, and now we have something that I think is probably worth thinking about as being more normal politics. I mean, if you went back to the earlier part of the 20th century, it would not be surprising to people to find that 20 or 25 or 30% of the voters were willing to express these extremist views. I think that's just kind of a fact about most democracies most of the time. The other point that I just wanted to make briefly is about the attachment of ordinary citizens to democratic procedures. You mentioned these survey experiments that find that there isn't much of that. I've done, I think, more concrete analysis in the US looking at the 2022 election and what happened to the Republican members of Congress who supported Trump's Stop the Steal efforts in various ways after the election by voting to decertify electoral votes on January 6th, or voting to prevent Trump from being impeached, or even voting to establish a commission to investigate what happened on January 6th. And the short story is that the people who supported Trump were strongly advantaged in the Republican primaries. They were much more likely to win their primaries and get to the general election than the people who stood up to him. And once they got to the general election, there was really no cost or benefit on average to having supported Trump. So I think that's a pretty concrete example of the limitations of democracy in the abstract as an electoral issue, not only in the US, but I suspect in many other places as well. Not because people consciously turn against democracy, but because democracy is such a flexible concept that people can support democratic erosion and backsliding under the label of supporting democracy by some other argument about what democracy means in a particular time and place. I think part of the difficulty of producing the kinds of institutional or political guarantees that you're hoping for, or that we're not sure what it is exactly that we're trying to guarantee.
Well, thank you. We have an audience that has been waiting very patiently. I suggest we take 2 or 3 questions in a row and then give the floor back to Larry. Just giving people a little bit more time. Okay, yes. Why don't we start with you?
Hi, hello. Hi, I'm Sanne van Oosten. I did my PhD here at the University of Amsterdam, but I'm now working in the UK. And I very often, as a scholar in the UK, very often we get questions from policymakers asking us, what to do about everything that's going on. And I very often cite the kind of data that you're also working with, where I kind of say, well, immigration attitudes are actually very stable. And then I always get all these questions, and I was wondering whether you can help me out. Whenever people say, yeah, but what about refugees? What about the boats? What about, like in Slovenia, the people in the Balkan route? What about these more specific kinds of immigration? And I was wondering what you say about maybe there might be a shift there that will actually is more important than the general immigration attitudes. So I was wondering if you could help me out. The other question is, what should we do about this? Like, democracy erodes from the top. What now?
Can we take one more? Yeah?
Sure.
Is that okay? How about you?
Hello,
Yeah,
sir.
the microphone.
Microphone. Well, first of all, thank you very much for...
You can use mine.
Oh, cheers, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for speaking, and you speak very clearly and eloquently, and it was very enjoyable to listen to, so thank you for that. My question was kind of building up on a previous point made, because do you not think it's slightly problematic, or at least quite limiting, that your book uses data that's only up until 2019, given that the COVID pandemic happened after, which made a lot of people lose trust in the governments and government systems in Europe, and a lot of massive parties that gained traction over the course of the past years have done so after 2019. Well, thinking of Marine Le Pen, who has now gotten very big in France, but also Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, which seems to be an important point which may be left out. So
Thank you.
how do you fix that?
Well, I think the way to fix it is to wait for more data to arrive. I hope people will be working on that. I think there's a connection between what I want to say about the pandemic and what I want to say about immigration, which is first that the data are limited and maybe unhappily general, but I think in some ways if we're interested in public opinion, that's probably a good thing, because I think public opinion is not that sophisticated in terms of the distinctions that it's likely to make about different circumstances or different particular aspects of the issue. So if people talk about some particular policy buzzword, it's usually because the political leaders that they support for other reasons have made a point of using this language, and so they do tend to pick up and mimic the rhetoric of political leaders that they support for other reasons. But mostly their attitudes, I think, really, to the extent that they're real, are real at the level of more general attitudes. If you look at Hungary, for example, Orban supporters did come to denigrate immigrants and to talk negatively about the European Union, but only after he had been propagandizing on those points for a few years after he took power. So I often think of public opinion being correlated with the stands of parties as being kind of a product of those party stands, at least as much and often more than it is a bottom-up kind of connection between the views of citizens and party leaders. I don't have a lot of detailed data about immigration attitudes with respect to refugees, for example, but I can tell you that there was no real difference in these responses in places that were more or less heavily hit by the refugee crisis. There's really very little correlation between how much immigration there's been in particular countries over the last 20 years and how public attitudes about immigration have changed. Again, I think where we do see changes in attitudes, it often has to do with elite rhetoric. So in Germany, for example, in spite of having a pretty massive refugee crisis, there was really very little change in public attitudes. I think in part because Chancellor Merkel was speaking up so powerfully in support of refugees and immigration. In Sweden, there was a lot of friction about immigration, but really not much decline in support for immigration. And I think the story with respect to the pandemic is kind of similar. There doesn't seem to be a lot of connection between the severity of the pandemic in particular, between the severity of the pandemic in particular places and the extent to which we've seen something that looks like a political backlash. So it seems to have to do more with the success of political entrepreneurs in pointing to the pandemic as a reason for people to be disaffected or dissatisfied in one way or another, in much the same way as with the Euro crisis. Not much connection between the depth of the crisis in different places and the apparent political reaction. The other thing to say about that specifically with respect to the EU, and this was a parallel to the Euro crisis as well, is that people became briefly less satisfied with the European Union and its response to these crises, but even at the worst of the crisis, they still thought more highly of the EU than they did of their own national governments. And insofar as they were dissatisfied with the EU response, they mostly took that as a reason to want the EU to expand its activities and to have more authority rather than a backlash against the EU of the kind that's often portrayed in the press.
Okay, time for another round of questions. Yes, here in the back, and then we will go to you. Yes, please, with the black sweater. Oh. And if you could briefly introduce yourself. And one question per person, please. Yes.
Hi, thank you, Professor Bartel, for your talk and for the comments. I'm a student at the University of Amsterdam, and I found it really interesting how you, when you're talking about culpability for democratic erosion, how you distinguish between passive and active for both elites and for citizens. I was wondering, maybe you already, you likely write about this in your book, but I haven't read it yet, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on what would qualify as active resistance to democratic erosion, I guess, or active support for democracy for citizens. I ask this specifically because I guess if you talk about trading off democratic or anti-democratic tendencies for, I guess, perceived satisfaction with the economy or satisfaction with governance. And to me, if you're in the media receiving messages about democratic erosion and you still trade off those, democratic values, or you trade off democracy against economy and other issues, then that's already somewhat of a stance. But I understood that you would qualify that as passive on behalf of citizens. So I would love to hear more about your thoughts about that.
Thank you for this question. Then with the pink shirt, and then we move to the gentleman in the front.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My name is Delaney. I'm also a PhD with the University of Amsterdam. And I was curious, I haven't read your book yet either, so I don't know if you go into the US context at all, and if you have data on that. I'm from the US, so I'm inherently curious what your perspective is on if these patterns that you locate here, you think they also are reflected in the United States, or if you think there's something different going on.
Thank you. And we'll take one more question here in the front.
Okay, thank you. I'm Veit Bader, Professor Emeritus in Sociology and in Social and Political Philosophy. Doesn't work?
No.
It works, huh? Okay. I have three combined...
Just one question, please, because...
Well, then I stop. wanted to intervene immediately. So,
yeah, you may ask one question. Please, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Then, with regard to the problem mentioned by you, obviously there is a huge tension between rule of law, constitutions, and so on, and democracy broadly understood. And there is no unique context-independent solution, but there are excellent examples. So take the Canadian notwithstanding clause, which productively addresses this issue in a way where lots of other representative democracies could do. Is there room for...
Thank you. No, everyone else has stuck to the one question rule, so thank you very much. And it's a lot for Larry also to remember, so please.
Thank you all. Yeah, I mean, in terms of active and passive resistance, my sense is that, most people are passive about politics most of the time. There's a minority of people who are deeply engaged and have at least the potential to take leadership positions in terms of trying to build resistance to democratic erosion or democratic backsliding. My sense is that mostly that exercise is going to be more successful if it is itself wedded to substantive political values, maybe most importantly, but not only partisanship. So, in the United States, we have a sufficient degree of partisan polarization right now that the Democratic Party is able to try to argue against the Republican Party's efforts at democratic backsliding and build support for democracy in the abstract, which I think wouldn't exist except that people are imbued with the sense that it's our side that we're trying to preserve and their side that's trying to tear it down. So I think an important, often useful political strategy will be to build a support for democratic institutions and procedures, not only around democracy itself, but also around the set of values that these supporters of democracy value in their own right. In the United States, I would say the pattern is in some ways very similar. There are probably two important differences. One is that I think the level of intensity on the part of the people who are willing to engage in destruction of democracy, or at least in erosion of democracy, is stronger than it is anywhere, certainly in Western Europe, because of this image that people have in their head of a demographic transition. Extremists on the right in Europe use that kind of language, but I think it's really harder for it to get traction here than in the US, where the official demographic projections suggest that in, fill in the number, 15 years or 20 years or 25 years, the society as a whole will be what's called majority-minority. Now, that's a difficult concept in itself and maybe meaningless at some level, but I think it is really up the level of anxiety and frustration among people who already have viewed themselves as being on the losing side of history and as being the victims of a huge amount of social change over the last half century. And so trying to understand that context, I think, is probably important to understand the extent, to, if any, to which it's possible to diffuse that sentiment. But the other thing that's different about the U.S. is the political institutions, the two-party system. In most parliamentary systems, it's likely that these forces are going to, at some point, organize themselves as a party and get some substantial share of votes, which will earn them some substantial representation in Parliament. And then the question is, how do the mainstream parties deal with them in coalition politics and in parliamentary affairs? whether it's cordoning them from power entirely or trying to compromise with them in some way or throwing up their hands and just letting them govern and hope for the best. In a two-party system, the danger arises when this faction, which is still, far from a majority, manages to gain control of one of the major parties, which is what happened to the Republican Party, more or less by accident in 2016. So now the Republican Party is heavily invested in Trump and therefore in this project of democratic erosion, or at least potential democratic backsliding. And so I think that makes the situation more dangerous than it would be in a system like a parliamentary system. But where the real issue arises, I think, remains with the more mainstream politicians. It's harder, I think, for, if you want to say, mainstream Republican politicians to stand up to Trump within the same party and subject to the same primary voters that are expressing the support for Trump than it would be in a parliamentary system where they were engaged in an official coalition bargaining with him but had their own party support and institutionalization to fall back on. So I think that's an aspect of the American situation that makes it more difficult. Canada, has some really innovative institutions that seem to be working right now. Whether they would continue to work in the same circumstances that we've seen in the U.S. or that we've seen in some parts of Europe, I think remains to be seen. I'm mostly pessimistic about institutions working in a general, absolute way, but it's certainly worth searching for institutions that might work even in a partial and temporary way, given the idea that these threats to democracy are often themselves likely to be partial and temporary in a matter of immediate political context more than they are the kind of existential crisis that we often think about when we think about crises of democracy. I mean, if there is significant democratic backsliding in the U.S. in the next year or in the next 10 years, which I don't think is likely, but I think is not, entirely implausible, I don't think it will be a 20-year or a 30-year or a 50-year pattern.
Hey, we have time for one more question, I believe. And I'm sure someone still would like to ask. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Niklaas Lange. I'm professor of public health at this university. You convinced me by showing data that there's no bottom-up erosion of democracy. But you haven't convinced me yet of the title of your book, that it's top-down. I heard some case studies, I saw some examples. My question would be, what data are needed or what evidence is needed to substantiate that? And why is it the top? Why isn't it the middle?
Well, the cases that I looked at are ones in which powerful politicians took these actions. And I think in most case studies that we've observed, not only of contemporary democratic backsliding, but also of full-scale breakdowns of democracy in other times and places, the story is one in which the people who have political power are the ones who are exercising that power in order to try to entrench themselves in power and pursue their own goals. I think the more interesting question in some ways from a scientific point of view is, why do all political leaders not do this? There, I think, are politicians who've been, at least to an approximation, in the same kind of circumstances that Orban was in after the 2010 election and could have taken the opportunity to engage in democratic backsliding and didn't. Unfortunately, I don't think we have a very good systematic understanding of why that is. I wave my arms and talk about political socialization. And so the answer to the question about what can we do about this is, vote for people who have strong democratic values, but that's not a guarantee either. And I think we really need a kind of step forward in political science that would give us a more systematic understanding of how it is that in some times and places these temptations to engage in entrenchment are taken up in significant part, and in other cases it's much less common. So the kind of democratic culture of political elites is an important black box here in my view, but not one that I can tell you anything very useful about.
Well, thank you. I think we've reached the end of our time. There is a ball, so I hope many of you will stay to continue the conversation. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. This was a wonderful turnout and great questions from the audience. I would like to thank the two discussants, Dr. Sarah de Lange and Dr. Nick de Boer, for their excellent commentary. And most of all, we want to thank you, Larry, for your wonderful presentation. And we're all looking forward to reading the book if we haven't already. So thank you.